The summer of 1936 carried with it the weight of a world teetering on the edge of transformation, a world where the old orders of power still clung desperately to their manufactured hierarchies of human worth. In the grand amphitheaters of athletic competition, where nations sent their finest specimens to represent the supposed superiority of their peoples, there existed an unspoken understanding that certain men were born to dominate and others were destined merely to participate. The tracks and fields of international sport had long served as stages upon which these racial mythologies played themselves out, where white athletes from European nations and their colonial extensions performed their expected roles as champions while athletes of African descent were tolerated as curiosities, as exceptions that somehow proved the rule of their collective inferiority. It was within this charged atmosphere of prejudice masked as scientific certainty that two men would find themselves locked in a rivalry that transcended mere athletic competition, a confrontation that would expose the hollow foundations upon which an entire ideology of human classification had been constructed. The man who would become the subject of public mockery had emerged from circumstances that the comfortable classes of society could scarcely imagine. Born into the grinding poverty of the American South, in a small community where the legacy of slavery still cast its long shadow over every aspect of daily existence, he had known hunger as an intimate companion from his earliest memories. His family had migrated northward as part of that great exodus of black Americans seeking escape from the terrorism of Jim Crow, trading the familiar horrors of the Deep South for the different but equally challenging struggles of industrial cities that promised opportunity but delivered discrimination in more subtle forms. In the crowded tenements and narrow streets of his new home, he had discovered that his body possessed gifts that set him apart from other children, an ability to run with a speed and grace that seemed to defy the limitations of his malnourished frame. Track and field became his sanctuary, the one arena where the color of his skin mattered less than the time on the stopwatch, where his worth could be measured in objective terms that even the most committed racist could not easily dismiss. His rival came from an entirely different world, a world of privilege and presumption that had never required its inhabitants to question their place in the natural order of things. Raised in a family of comfortable means, educated in institutions that reinforced at every turn the narrative of white superiority, this young man had been groomed from childhood to expect victory as his birthright. He possessed genuine athletic talent, there could be no denying this fact, but his abilities had been cultivated in an environment of support and encouragement that his future rival could only dream of experiencing. Where the black athlete had trained on makeshift tracks and worn shoes held together with determination and prayer, his white counterpart had enjoyed access to the finest facilities, the most knowledgeable coaches, and the unwavering confidence that came from a society that told him daily that he was destined for greatness. This fundamental inequality in their preparations would remain invisible to the crowds who gathered to watch them compete, invisible to the journalists who would chronicle their encounters, invisible to history itself until the moment of truth stripped away all pretense and revealed the naked reality of human potential unleashed. The mockery began in the newspapers, those powerful instruments of public opinion that shaped how millions of citizens understood their world. The white athlete, already celebrated as a national hero in his country, had given an interview in which he spoke with casual contempt about the black competitors he would face in the upcoming championship. His words dripped with the easy confidence of a man who had never been required to examine the foundations of his beliefs, who had absorbed the racism of his culture so completely that it had become indistinguishable from common sense. He spoke of physical differences, of the supposed limitations of the African mind, of the inevitability of his victory over opponents whose very participation in the same events he considered something of an insult to the purity of athletic competition. The newspapers printed his comments without critique, for they reflected the conventional wisdom of the age, the settled science of racial hierarchy that educated men accepted as readily as they accepted the laws of gravity. The black athlete read these words in silence, sitting in the modest room he shared with other members of his team who had been housed in segregated accommodations far from the comfortable hotels where white athletes enjoyed their preparations. His teammates watched his face for some sign of the anger they all felt, some indication that he would respond in kind to the provocations that had been so publicly delivered. But his expression remained calm, almost serene, as he folded the newspaper and set it aside with the same deliberate care with which he approached every aspect of his athletic preparation. When pressed by his companions to share his thoughts, he offered only a slight smile and a few quiet words that would later become legendary among those who witnessed this moment. He said simply that he would give his answer on the track, in the only language that could not be distorted by prejudice or diminished by hatred, in the universal language of athletic performance that recognized no nationality, no color, no creed. The day of their first direct confrontation arrived with an electricity that seemed to crackle through the very air of the stadium. Tens of thousands of spectators had gathered to witness what the press had already framed as a clash of civilizations, a physical manifestation of the ideological battles that were tearing the world apart. The white athlete entered the arena to thunderous applause, his blonde hair catching the sunlight in ways that photographers would capture for posterity, his confident stride projecting the absolute certainty of his impending triumph. He acknowledged the crowd with the practiced grace of a man accustomed to adulation, pausing to wave in the direction of the VIP section where political dignitaries sat in eager anticipation of the validation their theories of racial superiority were about to receive. When the black athlete emerged, the response was markedly different, a mixture of polite applause and uncomfortable silence that reflected the ambivalence with which his very presence was regarded by much of the assembled crowd. In the moments before the competition began, as the athletes prepared themselves for the physical and psychological battle ahead, the white rival committed an act of provocation that would seal his fate in the annals of sporting history. Walking past his black opponent with deliberate slowness, he paused to deliver a few words intended to be overheard by nearby officials and journalists. The exact content of these words would later be disputed, softened in some accounts and sharpened in others, but their intent was unmistakable. They were designed to humiliate, to remind this dark-skinned competitor of his supposed place in the hierarchy of humanity, to shake his confidence at the precise moment when mental fortitude mattered most. The white athlete smiled as he delivered this verbal assault, the smile of a man who believed himself untouchable, protected by the armor of his race and the certainty of his destiny. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, retold in countless variations but always with the same essential truth at its core. When the starting signal sounded and the athletes launched themselves into motion, the black competitor seemed to transform before the eyes of the astonished crowd. Every hour of solitary training, every meal skipped due to poverty, every insult absorbed in silence, every door closed in his face because of the color of his skin, all of it seemed to fuel a performance that defied what spectators had been taught to believe was possible. He did not merely win the event. He dominated it in a manner so complete, so utterly devastating to the narrative of racial superiority, that observers would struggle for years to find adequate words to describe what they had witnessed. His white rival, the man who had mocked him so publicly, finished so far behind that the gap between them seemed less like the difference between two athletes and more like the distance between delusion and reality. The stadium fell into a stunned silence that lasted several long seconds before erupting into a confusion of reactions. Some spectators applauded despite themselves, unable to deny the magnificence of what they had witnessed even as it contradicted everything they believed about the natural order of the world. Others sat in stony silence, their faces twisted with the cognitive dissonance of watching their certainties crumble before their eyes. The journalists in the press section exchanged glances of bewilderment, uncertain how to frame this result in terms that would be acceptable to their editors and readers. And in the section reserved for political dignitaries, there was visible discomfort, the shuffling of uncomfortable men who had come expecting to celebrate and now found themselves confronted with evidence that demanded they either revise their worldview or retreat further into the fortress of denial. The defeated rival stood bent over at the finish line, his hands on his knees, his chest heaving not merely from physical exertion but from the effort of processing what had just occurred. The confidence that had been so evident in his bearing before the race had evaporated completely, replaced by a bewilderment that made him seem suddenly younger, smaller, more human than the arrogant figure who had delivered those mocking words just minutes earlier. When he finally straightened and looked toward the victor, there was something in his eyes that witnesses would later interpret in various ways, some seeing the beginning of humility, others detecting the first stirrings of an anger that would curdle into lifelong bitterness. Whatever inner transformation was occurring, it was clear that the man who walked away from that finish line was not the same man who had arrived at it so full of certainty about his own superiority. The black athlete's behavior in the aftermath of his victory was perhaps even more remarkable than the victory itself. He displayed none of the triumphalism that his rival's earlier mockery might have justified, no public gloating, no retaliatory comments designed to humiliate his defeated opponent. Instead, he conducted himself with a dignity that stood in stark contrast to the ugliness that had preceded the competition, offering respectful comments about his rival's abilities while deflecting questions that invited him to engage in the kind of personal attacks that had been directed at him. This grace under pressure, this refusal to descend to the level of those who had demeaned him, would prove to be as powerful a statement as his athletic performance itself. It suggested a moral superiority that complemented his physical dominance, presenting a complete refutation of the stereotypes that had been deployed to diminish him. But this was only the first chapter of what would become a sustained narrative of humiliation for the man who had mocked so freely. In the days and weeks that followed, the two athletes would face each other repeatedly, and each encounter would produce the same result. The margin of victory varied, sometimes narrow enough to offer false hope to the defeated rival and his supporters, other times so vast that it bordered on the absurd, but the outcome never changed. The black athlete won and kept winning, piling victory upon victory until the accumulated weight of evidence became impossible for even the most committed ideologues to ignore. Each defeat etched new lines of frustration into the face of the white rival, each loss driving him to increasingly desperate measures in his training, his technique, his mental preparation, all to no avail. The psychological toll on the defeated rival became visible to those who knew him well, a slow erosion of the confidence that had once seemed as solid and permanent as stone. He who had spoken so easily of natural superiority now found himself haunted by questions he could not answer, doubts he could not silence, evidence he could not explain away. Some who observed his decline suggested that the cruelty of his fate lay not merely in losing but in losing to the very person he had most publicly disdained, as if the universe had designed a punishment perfectly calibrated to the nature of his offense. He had mocked a man based on the color of his skin, and that same man had responded by revealing the mockery to be not just wrong but spectacularly, historically, undeniably wrong. The rivalry between these two men became a prism through which larger social and political conflicts were refracted and examined. Journalists who had initially framed their encounters in terms favorable to the white athlete found themselves gradually forced to revise their narratives, to acknowledge however reluctantly that the expected order of things had been reversed. Scientists who had built careers on theories of racial hierarchy were confronted with data that contradicted their conclusions, forcing some to engage in ever more elaborate contortions of logic to maintain their positions while others began the uncomfortable process of reconsidering their fundamental assumptions. Politicians who had counted on athletic competition to validate their ideologies of supremacy discovered that sport, for all its usefulness as a propaganda tool, had the inconvenient tendency to produce results based on actual performance rather than theoretical expectations. The impact of these repeated defeats extended far beyond the personal psychological damage to the man who had mocked. Each victory by the black athlete sent ripples through communities across the world where people of African descent lived under the weight of similar presumptions of inferiority. In segregated neighborhoods of American cities, in the colonized territories of Africa and the Caribbean, in any place where dark skin was treated as a mark of diminished humanity, news of these triumphs arrived like messages of hope from a future that might yet be possible. Young boys who had been told they could never compete with their white counterparts now had evidence that contradicted this lie, proof that excellence recognized no color, that greatness could emerge from any community given the opportunity to develop and express itself. The white rival's attempts to reclaim his former glory grew increasingly desperate as time passed, his training regimens becoming more punishing, his mental state more fragile. Those who had once celebrated him as a symbol of their racial ideology now began to distance themselves, embarrassed by his consistent failures, eager to find new champions who might restore their faith in the natural order they so desperately wanted to believe in. The isolation that descended upon him mirrored, in its way, the isolation that his black rival had experienced throughout his life, but with a crucial difference. The black athlete had been isolated by the prejudice of others, excluded through no fault of his own, while the white rival was being abandoned because of his own failures, left alone by fair-weather supporters whose allegiance had always been conditional on his ability to validate their beliefs. Years later, when the heat of competition had cooled and both men had long since retired from active athletic pursuits, the story of their rivalry would be examined and re-examined by historians seeking to understand the complex relationships between sport, race, and society. Some would focus on the athletic achievements themselves, analyzing technique and training methods and natural ability in an attempt to explain the consistent pattern of results. Others would explore the psychological dimensions, the impact of expectations and pressure and mental fortitude on competitive outcomes. Still others would situate the rivalry within the broader context of the era's racial politics, using it as a case study in the collision between ideology and reality, between what people wanted to believe and what the evidence actually demonstrated. The man who had paid the price for his mockery never fully recovered from the repeated humiliations he had suffered. His later life was marked by a bitterness that those who had known him in his youth found difficult to reconcile with the confident young champion they remembered. He gave interviews in which he attempted to explain away his defeats through various excuses, injury and illness and bad luck and even conspiracies, but these rationalizations convinced no one, least of all himself. The truth that he could never escape, the truth that pursued him through all the remaining years of his life, was that he had been definitively, repeatedly, publicly proven wrong. He had declared his superiority in the most explicit terms possible, and that declaration had been answered in the most explicit terms possible, with defeat after defeat after defeat. The black athlete, by contrast, carried his victories with a lightness that belied their historical weight. He continued to compete at the highest levels for many years, adding to his collection of triumphs, but he never seemed to define himself primarily through his dominance over any single rival. When asked about the man who had mocked him, he responded with a generosity that some interpreted as strategic and others as genuinely felt, acknowledging his rival's talents while declining to engage in the kind of personal attacks that his rival's earlier behavior might have justified. This magnanimity was itself a form of victory, a demonstration that he had transcended not only his rival's athletic abilities but also his rival's moral limitations. The story of their rivalry has echoed through the decades, finding new relevance in each generation that rediscovers it. In times of racial tension and social conflict, it is held up as evidence that claims of inherent superiority will always eventually be exposed as the hollow constructions they are. In moments of athletic triumph by competitors from marginalized communities, it is invoked as a precedent, a reminder that the breaking of barriers has a long and honorable history. In discussions about the relationship between confidence and arrogance, between self-belief and delusion, it serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing prejudice to distort one's perception of reality. The stadium where their most famous encounter took place still stands, though it has been renovated many times over the intervening years. Visitors who walk its corridors can sometimes feel the echoes of that day when a man who had been publicly mocked delivered his answer in the only language that could not be denied. The track has been replaced, the seating reconfigured, the facilities modernized, but something of the original spirit seems to linger, a reminder that this was a place where history pivoted, where the lies of an entire era were exposed by the simple act of one man running faster than another. The price paid by the rival who mocked was not measured in money or material loss but in something far more valuable and far less recoverable. He paid in certainty, in the comfortable assumptions that had structured his understanding of the world, in the confidence that had once seemed his most powerful asset. He paid in legacy, becoming not the hero he had imagined himself to be but a cautionary example of what happens when arrogance collides with reality. He paid in history itself, his name remembered not for the victories he had anticipated but for the defeats he had never imagined possible. And the man who had been mocked, the nobody who had dared to believe he could compete with those who considered themselves his natural superiors, he too became part of history, but in an entirely different way. He became a symbol of what is possible when talent meets determination, when preparation meets opportunity, when the human spirit refuses to accept the limitations that others would impose upon it. He became proof that the hierarchies of human worth constructed by the powerful are nothing more than convenient fictions, maintained only so long as they go unchallenged, crumbling into dust the moment they are confronted with undeniable evidence of their falsity. The summer of that fateful year has long since passed into the realm of memory and then into the realm of history and now into the realm of legend. The crowds that gathered to witness the collision between mockery and excellence have all departed from this world, their cheers and gasps and stunned silences preserved only in written accounts and fading photographs. The political systems that invested so heavily in theories of racial superiority have been defeated and discredited, their champions revealed as architects of unimaginable horror. The world has changed in ways that those spectators could never have predicted, though in other ways it remains stubbornly, frustratingly similar to the world they knew. But the essential truth revealed on that day remains as relevant as ever. When a man mocks another based on the color of his skin, when he presumes superiority based on accident of birth rather than demonstrated merit, when he speaks with the casual confidence of one who has never been required to question the foundations of his privilege, he runs the risk of being definitively, permanently, historically proven wrong. He runs the risk of paying a price that no amount of rationalization can offset, a price measured in the currency of exposed falsehood and eternal humiliation. The rival who mocked paid that price in full, and the one who was mocked collected the payment with a grace and dignity that made the victory complete. In the final accounting, this is perhaps the most important element of the entire story, not merely that arrogance was punished but that it was punished by excellence combined with character, by triumph accompanied by magnanimity, by victory that elevated rather than diminished the human spirit. The man who was mocked had every opportunity to become bitter, to allow the cruelty directed at him to poison his own soul, but he refused this path. He answered mockery with performance, prejudice with excellence, hatred with a quiet dignity that history has rewarded with immortality. This, then, is the legacy of that rivalry, the lesson that echoes across the years from that stadium to the present day. Those who mock from positions of presumed superiority should beware, for the universe has a way of collecting its debts, of arranging circumstances that expose the hollow foundations of arrogance and prejudice. And those who are mocked should take heart, for the answer to cruelty lies not in counter-cruelty but in excellence, not in descending to the level of one's tormentors but in rising so far above them that their mockery becomes the measure of their own limitations rather than a reflection of reality. The rival who mocked paid the price, and in paying it, he became an eternal example of the consequences that await all those who mistake the prejudices of their era for the permanent truths of human existence.